Hello everybody and welcome to episode 4 of Thomas and Friends in 5. The subject of today's episode is Henry. We have a lot to cover, so let's get right into it. Henry is one of the anthropomorphic locomotive characters in the Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends universe. Anthropomorphic refers to non-human things, like objects or animals that have human characteristics. Henry is one of the first 3 Thomas and Friends characters to appear in the Thomas and Friends universe. He appeared in the first of the original The Railway series books titled 3 Railway Engines, written by Wilbert Awdry and published in May 1945. In case you're wondering who the other 2 railway engines are in that first book, they're Edward and Gordon. Henry runs on the Northwestern Railway, or NWR for short. His livery is the NWR green with red pinstriping or lining and a yellow number 3, also outlined in that red pinstriping. Henry is a mixed traffic locomotive, meaning he pulls passenger coaches as well as freight cars. Henry is a 460 tendered steam locomotive, which means he's fueled by coal and water stored in a separate piece of rolling stock pulled behind the locomotive called a tender. The numbers 460 refers to the White Notation, which is a wheel arrangement classification system for steam locomotives, and some non-steam locomotives. In Henry's case, he has 4 unpowered leading wheels, 6 drive wheels, and no unpowered trailing wheels, hence 460. Those unpowered leading wheels are also referred to as pilot wheels or leading axles. The tender wheels don't count when it comes to the White Notation, just the locomotive wheels. Henry's job on the Northwestern Railway is hauling both passenger coaches and freight cars, otherwise known as goods trucks. This makes Henry a mixed traffic locomotive. Due to Henry's size and strength, he often hauls the heaviest and longest freight trains. Personality-wise, Henry is a friendly engine who is respectful of the smaller engines, he's level-headed, and often the voice of reason. Henry does have bouts with arrogance, and has been known to antagonize his fellow locomotives, though he tends to feel bad about it later on. He's a hard-working engine, though he was plagued with design issues which caused him to have difficulty hauling heavier loads early in his time on Sodor. But we'll get to that in a bit. Now, before we get into the real-life locomotive basis for Henry, we have to give a brief history of a few key events. Henry arrived on Sodor as a big but underpowered locomotive. From the research we've done, it's more than likely he was based on a prototype LNER Gressley 462, similar to Gordon, upon his arrival. This early book illustration seems to show trailing axles, which would make him a 462 at the beginning of the series. The reason for his lower power was a small firebox, which simply couldn't get hot enough to create the necessary steam for an engine of his size. This may have been a shortcoming of being a prototype design. During the time Henry was underperforming, he had an episode of vanity when, on a rainy day, he refused to come out of a tunnel for fear of ruining his paint job. After a few attempts to get him to come out of the tunnel, the Fat Controller decided to brick him up in the tunnel to teach him a lesson. That seemed a little harsh, and a dark place for an animated series to go. Anyway, fortunately for Henry, Gordon broke down, and Edward was unable to pull Gordon's coaches, so they turned to Henry. They unbricked him from the tunnel and put him back to work. That, however, didn't miraculously cure his power issues, and they were further exacerbated by a delivery of poor quality coal. After replacing several parts with no improvement, it was time to consider replacing Henry with another locomotive. This was, of course, a low point for Henry. Then it was suggested they use a higher quality coal, Welsh coal, which they did, and has greatly improved Henry's performance. Things were starting to look up. Then Henry had an accident with the Flying Kipper. This should have been a setback, but it was actually the event that would change everything for Henry. After the accident, he was sent to the Crew Locomotive Works for a rebuild. It's after this rebuild where we'll pick up the story of the real-life locomotive basis for Henry. So Henry was rebuilt as a locomotive based on the LMS Stanier Class 5, nicknamed the Black 5. LMS stands for the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. The nickname Black 5 refers to the locomotive's livery or black paint scheme and the power classification of 5. The Stanier Class 5 Black 5 locomotives are 460 tendered locomotives designed by the well-regarded Chief Mechanical Engineer William Stanier during his time at the LMS Railway. There were an amazing 842 of these locomotives produced from 1934 to 1951. They were extremely versatile mixed-traffic locomotives and were literally described as the do-anything-go-anywhere type locomotive. When locomotives are built in this quantity and this level of versatility, they inevitably go through many modifications over the years. In this case, you'll find some of these locomotives with steam domes, some without domes, some with domes that aren't really domes, some with straight throat plates, some with sloped throat plates, some with longer wheelbases, and the list goes on. There are too many detailed changes and modifications to mention here, but you get the idea. The LMS Stanier Class 5s were withdrawn from service between 1961 and 1968, essentially replaced by diesel locomotives. There were 18 preserved, though the rest were scrapped. Well, that's going to do it for episode 4 of Thomas and Friends in 5. We hope this gave you a good general overview of Henry. But how did we do? Did we get everything right? Did we get anything wrong? Leave it in the comments below, and we'll see you in the next episode.